Good morning, everybody. Hi, my name is Lana Jorko. I come from the Network of Education Policy Centers, which is a network of educational NGOs and think tanks from 20 countries in the semi-periphery and beyond. I'm the first time here in the Degrowth Conference and feel extremely honored to be asked to actually facilitate the very last closing session of our conference. I will just take you through the day so that you know what you can expect. This will be a relatively long session, which will be structured in two parts. At the very beginning, we will have a lecture by Gareth Dale, and then follow-up of questions and answers. And then after that, we will invite members of the organizing team, Mladen, Sandra, and Vincent, to give us the summary of the whole conference. We should be out of this room by 12:30, but there will be, or thereabout. After that, there will be a parade, and people will tell you about all of these logistics at the very end of this session. This will be followed by a lot of convivial activities. I'm very happy. One of the things that I've got from Degrowth is all this new vocabulary. I didn't know it was called conviviality, but it's very good for any community, and I'm sure it can do excellent things for the Degrowth community as well. So I will just very briefly introduce Gareth Dale today. We're very happy to have him with us. He teaches politics at Brunel University in London, and his main research areas are very much connected to the whole conference. So Eastern Europe, economic growth, and of course Karl Polanyi. He has of course authored numerous books and edited many. I will not go into details. I'm sure you can find all about it from different sources, but now I will give Gareth my word. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. I feel like a DJ here. There's two laptops, one for my own notes, and someone's dictaphone and a glass of water. Something's bound to go wrong, so just keep your fingers crossed. The first thing that's gone wrong is I wasn't sure what the title of this talk is. The conference organizers asked me to speak, and they put a kind of title for this overall morning session as a whole, but I never got around to suggesting one, so I've just left the title page blank. I mean, why should I do the work of thinking up a title? You should do a little too. I leave it to your imaginations. For those who are feeling a bit imaginatively challenged at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning, I put up a little graphic to help you get the juices flowing. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm not a card-carrying degrowther. I'm a fellow traveler of your movement, essentially. So the invitation came as a huge surprise to me, but a very welcome surprise. I've really enjoyed this conference very much. And as a little token of appreciation, I brought along a copy of a book I edited this year on a critique of green growth, to give to one of the organizers, but you don't seem to have a central dictator organizing the conference for some reason, so I don't know who to give it to. So one of you is welcome to come and pick it up at the end. So I'm not a card-carrying degrowther in a sense, but I am a critic of the growth imperative, and my thinking on these questions has been irrigated these last few years by ideas from the degrowth community. I think you're asking really excellent questions. Perhaps in the background, what led me to my obsession with growth and degrowth was some attributes of my political formation. I come from a background that's sort of extreme red and extreme green, if you like, and there are sort of contradictory views on growth between these two colors of the political rainbow. Secondly, I lived in East Germany for a little bit towards the end of the 80s, and I was intrigued with what I found there in terms of the way the system was legitimated, the governing ideological supports of the regime. Because they were, the key ideological supports of the regime were ones that I was very familiar with. Nationalism, economic growth. There was an obsession with keeping up with the growth rates of the West, for example. Then later on, when I secured my first position in academia, I was struck by my management's declaration that our mission was to grow the department and grow the university. for those of you who are non-native English speakers, it might not appear so weird, but we've seen a strange corruption of the verb to grow. Until recently, to grow could only be used in a transitive sense to refer to nature, or to living things, or to parts of living things. So, I can grow flowers, or I can grow a beard. And now it's suddenly morphed into this business-friendly term for, growing our department, growing our university. Oh, sorry.
Maybe it's easier for you.
Okay, if I'm shouting or whispering or something, do shout back or whisper things, put me straight. And I was reminded of this strange obsession with growth even in my own workplace. Some years later, when I applied for a fellowship to study the growth paradigm, the ideology of economic growth, from a political perspective, of course. We have research mentors in our department, and they're desperate that we get big bags of money coming into the department or into the university, and so that we're successful with our grants. So they come around with a knock on your door and bring a kind of crib sheet full of phrases that you're supposed to take from the crib sheet and put into your application to the big funding bodies that you're applying to help ensure that you get the funding. And I looked down this crib sheet, and the first words were, what my research will do to contribute to economic growth, A, of the nation, and B, of the university, and so on. I said to her, look, I'm researching a critique of economic growth. Surely this is not going to add up in the minds of the people adjudicating this application. It's ridiculous. Despite all that, I somehow, luckily, was awarded the fellowship, and that led me to try to get to grips with the growth paradigm. And by the growth paradigm, I mean basically the idea that economic growth is the economy is an actual sphere of society which has an innate tendency to grow, that growth is a recognized social goal, social good, that it's imperative, and the remedy for a series of social problems. And what I've been trying to grapple with is how the growth paradigm originated, and more recently with how it has served to legitimate inequality. And I'm going to look briefly at each of these topics before moving on to topics that the conference organizers actually asked me to address. And those topics they asked me to address were lessons of historical socialism, New Left Alliances, and Karl Polanyi. But then they asked me to do a separate meeting on Karl Polanyi, so I've spoken on Polanyi there. Basically. Oops, maybe that was a mistake. Basically, I asked the question, was Polanyi a degrowther avant la lettre? And then I gave the answer to it. But I'm not going to speak about that. I did at the Polanyi meeting, I was supposed to give out loads of flyers about a book that I've written on Polanyi, which has a big discount to encourage people to buy from this small left-wing bookshop rather than from Amazon. I'll put them on the table after the meeting outside if anyone's interested. So sorry about that. Anyway, so I'm going to start with a little historical digression. If Saturday morning, some of you might be needing a nap. If you're intending to fall asleep at any time, if you find history boring, now's probably the time. It's going to last about 7 or 8 minutes, so set your alarms, but try not to snore. So, researching the growth paradigm, I tried to find, I first began to scour the historical record to try to find examples of pre-modern societies that knew the growth paradigm, or at least knew glimpses of it. And there were quite a few that I looked at. I'm going to give you some brief thoughts on 3 of those. One really quite outstanding example comes from the Mauryan Empire in India, so about 2.5 millennia ago, because it was there in the Mauryan Empire that this guy, Kautilya, who was an advisor to the ruler of the Mauryan Empire, he wrote his Arthashastra, which is it's an astonishing book if you're interested in economic growth, because it's a kind of manual for rulers to increase their revenues, to expand their mining operations throughout the land, to expand manufacturing, logging, commerce, to construct highways, and to plan markets, and so on. So you read the Arthashastra, and you can see elements, little glimpses of something like a growth paradigm, but it's not. When you dig into it, you see that it's not the growth paradigm that we know at all. This was simply a set of policies to be put into practice by the state and for the state. There was a radical distrust of private wealth, and there was no sense that this was to be an ongoing and continuous process, let alone one that was somehow natural and normal. It was something that the state had to put into practice to expand the coffers of the king. And the ideology associated with the Arthashastra only really achieved a foothold among the royal household and the merchants. It didn't become a hegemonic ideology across society at large. So that's the first example. Second one, around the same time, 2.5 millennia ago, about 5,000 kilometers to the west, we saw a similarly flourishing society evolving in Athens and other parts of Greece. Philosophers, as you know, were beginning to study economic affairs. People such as Xenophon, for example. Xenophon was casting around for ways of increasing the coffers, the treasury of the Athenian polis. And he recommended a sustained expansion of Athens-controlled silver mines. Why? Because silver mines can never be exhausted, nor can silver ever lose its value. So this is the secret to filling up the treasury. It's a remarkable example of ancient commodity fetishism. As money, silver represents money, so the demand for it is infinite. It's the guarantor, therefore, of future Athenian revenue growth. So it's arguably a glimpse of the growth paradigm, and some people do see Athens as a growth-oriented economy, ancient Athens, but this was not a society in which the ideology of economic growth could take a serious root. Markets were fairly weakly developed, commerce was delegated to non-citizens. Even where trade did flourish, the pursuit of profit for its own sake was regarded as a grave threat to social order. You can see this in the gods of the time. Hermes was the god of trade, but he doubled as the god of theft. I don't know much about designer labels, but I gather there's one called, some sort of firm called Hermes, which is an odd name to give a firm, given that this is the god of shoplifting. Anyway. So in ancient Athens, the ethic of accumulation was mistrusted. And this, incidentally, and this is a digression within the digression, this was bound up with the concept of sufficiency. Now some green philosophers have, I think, correctly traced the idea of sufficiency back to the ancient Greeks, but they haven't done much digging around to explore its social context. And if they had done, some eyebrows would have been raised, because it belonged to, I think, a pretty dubious project. You see, in the age of democracy, ancient Athenian democracy, the aristocracy was suffering what we'd now call a kind of public relations image implosion. Democracy was coming into being, and they were seen as greedy, elitist, and anti-democratic. They were frantic to rebuild their reputation. Plato, Xenophon, Aristotle, and co., they began to achieve this, shoring up the reputation of the aristocrats by constructing a kind of ethos of aristocratic frugality and self-restraint. The morally virtuous aristocrats set up against democracy, and democracy for them went alongside coinage and money as a kind of horrible threat. It would reduce all human endeavor to the same kind of acquisitive, grasping, greedy, plebeian impulses. Aristotle, too, his idea of self-sufficiency, it combines references to an adequate supply of goods and to the ethic of self-discipline, so managing with enough, but also it's connoting ideas of aristocratic independence. So the truly free man does not serve others, the free man is sufficient unto himself because he commands the labor of others. So sufficiency in ancient Greek philosophy, was idealizing an image of the aristocrat's social position. The ideal figure, of course, was Socrates. His riches were sufficient to meet his desires. Here you can see the ethic of limits, of pursuing gain as an end in itself as contemptible, being put forward by people such as Xenophon, the same Xenophon who was at the same time trying to find ways to fill Athens' coffers, to build up its war machine and so on. It's just a little reminder that the individual ethical stance can be necessary, but if just it has to be understood within its social context. So that's the second example. The third, I'll be very brief indeed. A third fascination of mine on theorizing growth is we're fast forwarding to the 14th century AD. The Maghrebi philosopher Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was unusual for his age because he provided a kind of analytical description of growth, a very complex one. He talks about how the population increases. As the population increases, the labor supply increases, so too, therefore, the demand for goods. This leads to higher profits, which tends to accelerate, obviously, demand and, more indirectly, population growth. And a virtuous circle of growth occurs. But this, again, if you read it carefully, this was not the growth paradigm. Ibn Khaldun postulates negative feedback mechanisms. These ensure that the material progress that does occur, it inevitably hits barriers. And this theory of growth is also embedded within a cyclical understanding of history, whereby tribes occupy the towns and create empires, which then implode and the tribes disperse to the periphery again. So Ibn Khaldun is explicit that the virtuous circle of growth reaches an end point at which the civilization, and I quote him, has reached the limits of its abundance and growth. So just to sum up this section, some pre-modern civilizations, they did know commitments to certain types of growth. Monarchs expanded their territory and their treasure. Scholars would put forward proposals for improving the organization of farming or trade. But there was no sense that the economy can grow or should grow continuously. There was no growth ethic. There was no growth imperative. There was no growth paradigm. So this returns us to the question, when and where did the growth paradigm originate? Was it maybe the 1930s? Well, I'll stick out my neck and suggest it was Northwestern Europe in the 17th century. And you'll be glad to know that I'm not going to go into this incredibly complex issue in great detail. I'm just going to list 7 points. I'm going to slap them up on the screen and hope that you get some sort of sense of what they address and how they interconnect. And that should do for the sort of long-term historical section. So these 7 transformations that were centered in the 17th century involved the social construction of time and space, the emergence of the concept of linear time and gridded space that can be measured as an abstractly conceived set of variables. The obsession with agricultural improvement, especially in England, with its very marketized rural economy by that time. The scientific revolution, which linked with the market economy to produce a kind of positivist conception of the economy as a law-governed economic system. The economy is a system governed by laws, just as the universe in Newton's vision is a physical system governed by the laws of physics. So trade and capital accumulation began to be understood as following natural laws. And as economic life became geared to the expansion of value, a regime of quantification emerged, which combined with a revolution in ideas of national accounting to enable the wealth of a nation to be measured, and its growth, therefore, to be measured. If you compare England in 1600 with England in 1700, it's an incredible difference. In 1600, nobody had any idea what the population of England was, what its trade figures were, what its the value of its assets, anything of that sort. Just a century later, all of these figures had been nailed down in detail, which enabled comparisons to be made with other countries and comparisons in time, so that the idea of economic growth could be measured. Or sorry, not the idea of economic growth, the reality of economic growth could be measured. Then we had cornucopian visions. Now, these have always existed historically, of course, but they were connected in this period to the idea of free markets. The idea came about that supply and demand being potentially infinite, if they are to flourish, supply and demand have to be connected through markets, which will enable infinite material progress. The concept of growth at this time in this location began to migrate from describing simply the term growth, from describing simply the natural order, nature, to describing economic processes other than life cycles and agriculture and so on. So we had not only the growth of population, but the growth and increase of the colonial plantations, the colonial settlements, the growth of trade. These terms began to circulate in this period. And colonialism itself was important in a whole host of ways. For example, to the idea of linear social progress. The colonists, particularly those who conquered the New World, they encountered peoples there who they conceptualized within a racialized history of social progress. From their viewpoint, if they, the so-called savages, were at the primitive stage, had we once occupied it too? The answer, yes, we had. There's a kind of progress from the state of savagery to our civilized state. We are, of course, in the higher echelons of progress. How do we determine that? Because we have benefited from the scientific revolution, and we are the ones who improve. So in this way, ideas of social progress and economic growth became fused together. Those who grow the economy, those who are at the cutting edge of social progress in this well-known kind of story of racialized social progress. So all these changes were conjoined as part of an epochal transformation. And they raised, as this transformation gathered steam, it raised a host of new questions and dilemmas, including, above all, how you justify social inequality. The older social arrangements, in which inequalities were sanctioned by God and by custom, they were giving way to a more fluid new order. With market society came legal equality and tendencies to a sort of subtle democratization of society. In this new world of social mobility and individualism, how can you justify hierarchy? Of course, the old ideologies of religion, patrimonialism, and so on, they could be adapted to the task. They could be reinvented. But the traditional conceptions of a fixed hierarchy of social rank were much harder to maintain in this new order, with its ideas of individual self-interest, social mobility, and popular sovereignty increasingly as well. But might there be a way in which these new ideas of individualism and of progress and material growth, could they be sort of knitted together in a way that supports hierarchy and supports inequality? Well, I think the thinker who addressed this question most forcefully was Adam Smith. It's common knowledge that economic growth was at the front and center of Smith's work, but less well known is that he wove into his growth theory a sophisticated, in some respects, justification of social inequality. Material progress, the term of the period for economic growth, automatically, in his view, benefits the community as a whole. It brings higher living standards, a greater quantity of goods sold at lower prices. And this diminishes inequality. So for Smith, there's an automatic correspondence between welfare and the quantity of goods produced. And as capital increases, the nation's wealth, the nation's well-being, and the nation's welfare automatically increases too. And in Britain, where I'm from, this ideology, or this system of wishful thinking, if you prefer, This was given a political cutting edge just a couple of years after Adam Smith's death in the early 1790s. This was a time, the 1790s, a time of revolution in France and its colonies. Now, Britain and its colonies were facing turbulence too. Britain's elites were looking across the Channel and were panicked. How can we get the hoi polloi to calm down? And a very influential example was provided by William Paley. He was the dominant theologian of the age in Britain. He was a philosopher and a great admirer of Adam Smith. And he, in a mass-produced pamphlet addressed to the poor, he put forward two key arguments. One was God created frugality as a pleasure, so enjoy your poverty. The second was society may be awfully unequal, but this is just a byproduct of a system that is fostering the industry and the arts, and therefore benefits us all, as Adam Smith argued. Paley advised the poor, he said, the change and the only change that you should desire is gradual and progressive improvement of your circumstances. And this is the natural fruit of successful industry or economic growth. Each year brings us a few more conveniences and comforts to add to our little poverty-stricken household. Each year brings something a little bit better and little luxuries that we can enjoy some more. Now, the key sentence, this is achievable in a state of public order and quiet. It is absolutely impossible in any other, and I think this can be summarized in the quote, in the aphorism at the top. The rising tide lifts all boats, so lifts us all, so don't rock the boat. You can mix this in with Urios's lifeboat metaphor and get some interesting results, probably. Anyway. So what I'm arguing is that the growth paradigm unsettled previous ideologies of social hierarchy, but it was then used to justify a new ideology of social hierarchy. Everyone will benefit from economic growth, so the poor should not put that growth in jeopardy with your protesting, your rioting, your rebellions, and so on. If you do that, you won't get your nice little extra convenience and comfort each year that has been promised to you. This, I think, became a kind of mantra of conservative and liberal thought down the ages, and in a modified form, of course, of social democracy. For social democracy, the image is slightly tweaked. For social democracy, the rising tide will lift us all if we are in power, so rock the boat, but just enough to make that happen. Now, economic growth was not a major element in social democratic thinking in its earliest era. This has been put quite neatly by the so-called Nobel Prize-winning economist Arthur Lewis. Economic growth played little part in the blueprints of socialism of the 19th century. But particularly when social democratic parties began to enter government in the early 20th century, they felt constrained to mobilize their supporters, their followers, behind goals that could be pursued within a capitalist framework. And of this, growth became a key part, because, the idea was expand the bakery in the hope that the supporters and members of and voters of the social democratic parties will get more crumbs from the bread that fall off the table. So, for the social democrats, really attempting to run a capitalist system, I think inevitably led them to accept the growth paradigm, to incorporate it into their worldview, because the growth paradigm had evolved as an ideology of capital accumulation, as an ideology in the sense of a way of organizing our vision of the world, particularly in ways that obscure and naturalize power relations. So the growth paradigm emerged as an ideology of capital accumulation, because capitalism as a system of competition, it depends on the growth of capital. But if that was nakedly visible to us all, or conceivable in a very clear fashion, that would not suit the system. But, so as a system of competition, it depends on growth, but as a system of social control, it depends on obscuring the purposes, the central purposes of growth. And for this, the growth paradigm is absolutely vital. It glosses capital accumulation as something of general interest to humanity or the nation, economic growth, and not as a process of exploitation that privileges the few and reinforces structural inequality. And of course, the growth paradigm plugs neatly into another central ideology of modernity, namely nationalism. Therefore, as capitalism spread around the world, growth became the mission, the internalized mission of all states of the world. That includes the core states of the liberal heartland, United States, Britain, Netherlands, and so on, and their former colonies, and the challenger states and the semi-peripheral states, which often had very interventionist governments and often had economic planning arrangements. I'm thinking of countries such as Japan, North Korea, South Korea, China, the Soviet Union. So in my analysis, Soviet Union and these other countries are forms of state capitalism. For me, the old joke makes sense. What's the difference between communism and capitalism? Capitalism is the exploitation of man by man. Communism is the exact opposite. And so the growth imperative in the Soviet societies were, in my analysis, essentially for the same reason as in the West, competitive accumulation of military power and of capital. And the competitive element was explicit in the Soviet bloc. Central planners were continually, I've read a lot of the archives, and you keep on finding Politburo members asking their flunkies to go and search the statistical archives to find out, not archives, the statistics to find out how the various other countries that Western Europe, what their growth rates were. And the planners were continually trying to compare their performance against Western benchmarks and to match economic growth of the West. They sought to apply science and technology systematically to the production process, tailorist techniques to the labor process, with performance targets for each employee. It's very, this isn't so exotic at all. In British academia, we have a very similar target culture with proxy metrics, with performance management regimes, pretty similar to those that I've studied in East Germany. And the goal was to create what Martha Lampland has called, in this excellent new book, it's coming out later this month, what Lampland calls, the goal was to create in the Soviet societies a mass of individuated workers, I'm quoting her, unfettered by the drag of an antiquated collectivity, and devoted to exceeding plan targets and to growing the economy. And because the economy was geared very forcefully towards capital accumulation, the population was mobilized behind the goal of capital accumulation. Consumption was ratcheted down, and so rapid growth rates in some periods of the history of the Soviet societies could occur at the same time as very low levels of living standards, particularly in the early phase, but also beyond that as well. This caused some difficulties for the opposition groups. I'll speak about East Germany because it's the country I lived in and was very politically active in, so I knew the best. There was an opposition there that found the question of popular consumption quite difficult to deal with, particularly in the 1989 revolution when higher living standards was certainly on the minds of a lot of relatively poor people in East Germany. How do you deal with that? They found it quite problematic because the opposition had existed in a kind of a ghetto, or nowadays we'd call it a bubble. We think of, you know the concept of the bubble that people live in because their social media, the algorithms of your social media direct you only to the status updates of other people who think like yourself. So you think, your bubble is the world, and you live in this bubble, and you're not very in touch with the rest of the world. But these bubbles existed before the internet and before social media. And the example in East Germany was that the state managed to very effectively prevent the opposition groups with their very politicized and radicalizing views, keep them shut off from the rest of society. And they were ghettoized, essentially, in the Protestant church, where they were allowed to have little meetings and to talk about not so political questions like moral regeneration and ethics and what's happening in Nicaragua on the other side of the world and those sorts of things. And they became very cut off from the rest of the population, which came into vision very forcefully when millions of people in East Germany who had been relatively unpolitical for decades suddenly became very interested in politics, educating themselves very rapidly and getting out on the streets and trying to do something about the repressive circumstances in which they found themselves. And the opposition was very good at relating to the mass movement in some ways, but not so good in others. And here's an example. I mean, the biggest... Spot the German readers in the audience. The biggest... this is a lovely, beautifully designed poster, but it says, this is from New Forum, the biggest of the opposition organizations. It's better to take part in communal politics than to drink yourself to death on Coca-Cola. And then New Forum is it, a little bit of kind of American style slang there as well. New Forum is it. And so this sort of, there was a degree to which basically the opposition failed to understand a lot of the motives for the demands for higher living standards of the mass of the population. Demands for higher living standards were very much bound up with questions of dignity and self-worth and so on. People in the East doing a job for 45 hours a week and earning 700 marks were comparing their circumstances to very similar people in the West who were getting paid 3 times that much for a working week of only 38 hours. And they were saying, this isn't fair, and we're working hard too, and we want our worth and our work to be valued. And whatever you think about the macro social consequences of these sorts of demands for higher living standards, you have to be able to imagine yourself into that world. Basically, the opposition groups proved to be brilliant at imagining alternative societies, at sort of mapping out blueprints for alternative societies. They had incredible imagination. But when it came to imagining the lives of the people living next door to them or down the road, there was an astonishing paucity of imagination. They were reading too much science fiction, or science fantasy, if you want to put it metaphorically, and not enough gritty social realism. They weren't watching enough, I don't know, Ken Loach movies or the equivalent in East Germany. Sorry, there's too many arcane illusions there. So, will the degrowth movement here in the world today be similar to the East Germans? I don't know. I look at the work of Joan Martinez-Allier, for example, and I'm optimistic that we'll suffer no such fate, but who knows? Who knows? So I should begin to draw threads together now. I've been talking long enough. What then can we learn from historical socialism? Given that the growth imperative and its ideology, the growth paradigm, are such central features of capitalism, wherever leftist forces come to power in localities, regions, towns, cities, and the state, and attempt to manage capitalism, they seem to end up reproducing growth boosterism in one form or another. We've seen this with social democratic parties for a long period, and more recently with green parties. And where a very radical socialist revolution succeeds, as in Russia in 1917, but fails to spread, where it becomes beached and besieged, the competitive pressures of global capitalism in military and economic forms impose themselves and force the post-revolutionary society back onto capitalist tracks. Those same pressures impose themselves on small-scale projects too. Think of, microcredit, which was so hopeful to so many people for a long time, but has increasingly been revealed as a sort of insidious form of neoliberalism. Or think of the various forms of technological fetishism, the idea that we can 3D print our way to a degrowth society or whatever. Or of the so-called sharing economy, which is the major bastions of which are revealing themselves to be a new mode of capital concentration on an incredible global scale, this motto has it. So this compulsive dynamic, we all agree on this, in the long run has to be stopped. Walter Benjamin's metaphor is the one I always have in mind. If the social process is a train, the revolution is not the locomotive, but pulling the emergency brake. So revolution understood as a kind of bottom-up, mass-based and democratic process, a world-changing movement that connects together all those who suffer injustice and oppression, to connect them with the people with latent economic power, working people. But of course, for some crucial issues, the long run is much too late. So in the meantime, what do? Well, obviously, we all agree we have to build movements that can bring about change in the short term and build confidence and consciousness to further goals of more radical change in the long run. The movements that we're building, all of us, I'm sure, are demonstrating the potential for a world in which people can live in comfort and security and flourish while ratcheting down resource use rapidly. But it's a difficult task, not least because of this question of equality and inequality, which I've argued earlier in this talk, has become so entrenched on the left. The idea that growth is required for progressive projects, and growth is required if ordinary people are to enjoy a decent standard of living. We have to challenge that. We have to try. How are we going to do it? It requires building alliances, all of which, because we live in a messy world, all of which require compromises. There are brilliant discussions in all sorts of books that people have been quoting from this conference. Naomi Klein's book, for example, on capitalism versus the climate contains millions of wonderful explorations of the alliances that can be built. My own little example that I was involved with, that I'm going to close on, was the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign in Britain, which was an alliance between trade unionists and climate activists, which was interesting in a couple of ways. It was a failure in some ways as well. And what I found interesting about it is that first of all, it tried to take a clear message on climate change to a pretty broad audience. We were speaking to large meetings of trade unionists all around the country for a long period of time. We developed a little program, a pamphlet, which argued that in 3 key sectors, a process of just transition could rapidly reduce the resource throughput in the British economy if the buildings of Britain were insulated. It's a cold country, of course. If private car use was transferred to public transport, to rail and to coaches and so on, buses and so on, bicycles and so on. And thirdly, of course, if the expansion of renewables, that this could rapidly reduce resource throughput whilst securing jobs and reskilling people and giving people a greater sense of purpose and job satisfaction and so on. And one of the other interesting ideas in it was the idea that this could all be done under the aegis of a kind of national climate service. A bit like the National Health Service in Britain. Now, the interesting thing about the National Health Service in Britain is that it's an extremely popular institution. Across the political spectrum, people believe in it. This is the right way to organize health. It's egalitarian. Everybody has essentially the same service. But it was an institution based upon radical, massive expropriation of private institutions. So it's a huge process of expropriation of all the private hospitals was inaugurated to establish the National Health Service. And so a massive process of expropriation of private capital can be very popular. This is what Matthias Schmelzer was talking about last night. You have to confront, given who controls the resources of the world, you have to confront the problem how to expropriate some of the major corporations. And so we were proposing that this could be done under the aegis of the National Climate Service, not obviously a purely state-run, top-down thing, with plenty of communal ownership and running, and for example, of small-scale renewable energy enterprises and so on. So we thought joining these dots together would work quite well. But of course, the alliances you're building are also with the people, sort of mainstream social democrats who believe in economic growth. One of the most brilliant members of our group was a guy called John McDonnell, who now happens to be the shadow chancellor in Britain, the Treasury Minister. Time to shut up. Okay. The shadow finance minister of the Labour Party, who's fantastically left-wing, and if Labour under Jeremy Corbyn were to come to power, I'm sure it'd be wonderful for British politics, but it's very much a growth boosterism. So there's some of the. It's just an example of the sort of alliances we were trying to build, some of the problems and compromises that we encountered. And so I'll just finish on this. What we were trying to do with that campaign was finding a way of responding to what I think is a multiple crisis of the growth paradigm. Because the growth paradigm is unbelievably powerful, scarily so, intimidatingly so, but it's facing a range of different crises in different terms. So in its own terms, it's facing a crisis because because per capita growth rates have for a long time been stagnating in much of the world or falling slightly, tending to fall over the years, over the decades. We measure per capita growth rates decade by decade. So even in its own terms, in pure capitalist terms, so to speak, re-establishing high growth rates is becoming more difficult. So there's an element of crisis in the internal logic of the system. Then there are widespread sources of growth skepticism. There's the entire range of social causes of growth skepticism. People who say, I used to believe that economic growth would improve living standards, but it no longer does. Therefore, I'm more skeptical. There's a huge range of ideas out there on those kind of lines. And obviously, most importantly, for me certainly, and for most people in this room, I'm sure, for ecological reasons. So the growth paradigm seems all powerful, but it's facing crises and facing huge opposition of which this wonderfully inspiring conference is an example. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Gareth. We have now quite a few minutes for questions and answers, so I will invite the audience to start raising their hands. I'll try to pick it up as soon as I see them. We have some help with the mics. Questions, reflections? We'll take a few. Gareth will take a few at a time, and then, is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, you will collect a few?
Yes, we'll collect a few. Oh. There.
Thank you very much for the speech. It has been a great pleasure to be part of this conference. However, I have one serious question. So what are we going to do now? How are we going to operationalize the ideas that we have been talking here until now? We really have to do something, or else we are really going to die drinking Coca-Cola. Thank you very much for your thought.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick question. What would you have exposed to us on Karl Polanyi in this respect?
In what respect?
The first 50 minutes.
Okay, that's an interesting question. You know,
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I have a question on the last part, and I want to know, I didn't quite understand what it, my name is Stefania Barca. I didn't quite understand what is your take on the 1 million climate jobs campaign in respect to the issue that you were raising in the end, that the growth paradigm is somehow in crisis. So I think that that's a very interesting point, but I want to understand, so you think the 1 million climate jobs campaign is part of the criticism against growth, or is it part of, is it a way of saving growth from its own crisis? Thanks.
okay, we'll take one more before we answer them. Here.
Hello, Anna Posse, Utrecht University. Thank you for your interesting presentation. Even if growth is more and more in crisis, politically right-wing parties are increasing and winning more votes and elections. What can the growth movement, allied to the left parties, do to counterbalance this? And also in relation to talks we had yesterday about aligning to different causes and fights, I think we can see that there is an increase. So the results in the UK and in other countries show a divide between urban areas and rural areas in terms of voting. It shows a divide between rural areas and urban areas in terms of voting. So what, yeah, I think we didn't discuss this enough, and maybe it's something also that's for future degrowth actions, or I don't know, connecting to rural and to, yeah. Thank you.
What are we going to do now? What was your question? I don't know. Sorry. But fortunately, this session is followed by another one, and they're going to answer that question. Karl Polanyi, well, it was very kind of you at the start of my talk to indicate that you were, you'd be more interested if I was speaking about Polanyi. There was some mix-up in my mind with or perhaps vis-a-vis the organizers here. I kind of thought that since when the second meeting was put on for me, I assumed that my Polanyi stuff should all go in there, and so I took it out of the talk for today. Kind of you to ask me about this. I guess partly as well, I've just been, you know, I was talking about the kind of growth imperative in our own workplaces. I'm not very good at getting big grants and doing the other things that you're supposed to do in academia, above all arse licking, and doing what management, in other words, sucking up to management. But, you know, I can write books, so I respond to the pressures on me just by writing more and more books, and I've written too many books on Polanyi. There's 3 come out this year, for example. It's a crisis of overproduction, and I'm afraid I just have, you know, having given one meeting earlier this week, I just had enough of Polanyi. I didn't want to mention him today. But I suppose I could write up the meeting I gave on whenever it was, Thursday, and put it online somewhere. I know. I don't have a blog. I don't even tweet. I mean, do sign up to my Twitter account. I've no idea what it is. I've no idea how to use it. I think I only have 7 followers, and I'm sure they think I'm some Real Madrid footballer who has a name similar to mine. So you can sign up to it if you like, but I know, I'll tell you what I'll do. I don't have a blog, but Yorios Kallis is setting up a blog, so I'll ask him if I can write up that talk and put it on his blog. And then the guy who asked me that question about Polanyi, okay, I'll put it on the degrowth blog. Sorry, Yorios. I mean, I'll give you back the 100 forints you gave me earlier. Right. So, having spectacularly failed to answer the first 2 questions, I'll try and deal with the third one, which was, what is your take on the 1 million climate jobs campaign? Is it a way of challenging the growth imperative, or is it a way of saving growth from its own crisis? And I thought that was a brilliant question. And the answer to the question is that it is both. Some of us involved with it were trying to use this as a way of engaging radically environmental, ecological, or whatever arguments to a wider audience. And okay, there was some growth, there was some sort of Green New Deal kind of growth boosterism involved in the campaign as well. But we were able to take that debate to a broader audience. And also, even if we had lost, imagine if even if this program of 1 million climate jobs had been instituted and had led to some economic growth because of all the work being put into laying railways and tramways and taking cars off the road and putting buses on the road and insulating people's houses. That all leads to economic growth in the short term. It also, at least, would dramatically reduce the potential for future resource throughput for obvious reasons, because people's basic needs are covered by a much more decarbonized economy. So even if the project had succeeded, but our faction of it had failed, at least it would have been, better than nothing, and it would have been a way of mobilizing ideas and a general critical spirit in society and bringing environmental ideas into the trade union movement, which we did do to some extent. So it was, it's part of those compromises that you have to make when you build alliances, and it was a compromise that I thought was certainly worth making. I thought it was a brilliant campaign, even though it didn't go nearly as far as we wanted in the end. To the question from Utrecht about right-wing parties increasing their... Yes, we're living in a world of civilizational crisis and social breakdown and troubling events around the world. And what can degrowth movements do? Well, first of all, I think clarity on the immigration and refugee issue is absolutely essential. And I was, this is my first degrowth conference, so I didn't know what to expect. I was very impressed indeed to see that right in the first plenaries, you had people such as Federico De Maria and Yorios Kallis making very clear arguments that the Herman Daly approach to immigration has no place on the degrowth map. And so putting those arguments in a very clear and united way against the right is a presupposition of future, of building a vibrant left with a major role for degrowth within it. The question on the divide between rural and urban areas, I didn't really follow, so I'm sorry about that. But we can talk about it after the session, I guess.
Thank you. We have time for another quick round. So, questions, comments?
Thanks a lot for this presentation and for the overview of where the growth paradigm is coming from. Risking to become very unpopular in this room, I still wonder whether, or what is your take on growth as also a driver of positive things it has promised, such as life expectancy, such as democracy, food security, and the like, which I guess our Western civilization is hugely built on, notwithstanding the negative impacts it has obviously had, and also agreeing with you that we are in crisis, but I would argue that Smith and others, as you pointed out, really had a point there in saying, or in finding this correlation between growth and wealth to some extent.
No more questions?
I should deal with that one. Okay, one.
Thank you, Gareth. I find your idea about narratives justifying hierarchy in society quite appealing. And I was thinking about what your suggestions are. Do we need an alternative narrative that is less destructive to social structures, to the environment? And how could such a narrative look like? Or should we go for a strategy that, or is it possible at all to create a society that is built on a narrative that allows to reduce the relevance of hierarchical differentiation between different groups in society? Thank you.
I would have liked to have your opinion about the degrowth perspective about the refugee crisis. As you said, it has been talked about in the opening session, but I felt like it was rather some kind of declaration of political principle rather than a very scientific degrowth research concerning this topic. And I think there are many questions concerning the organization of a degrowth community and the way this degrowth community could host refugees, and I feel like these questions have not been answered in the conference. So, yeah.
As I don't know very well English, I would like to know if you spoke about the technology solutions and the danger that is for the health, the Earth, the planet, and for us. For example, in France, they spoke about that, and it is very important that the people knows that's not the solution with technology. It's very dangerous for all.
Sorry, what's the real danger for all technology?
The technology about the climate solution. So we can...
You mean specific technologies like geoengineering, or do you mean technology with a capital T?
The technology to come to 0 or less grade.
Okay, that's it. You can answer the question.
I'll go. Okay. technology, I think the key problem is the sort of technological fetishism and the use of technological wishful thinking. We've heard a lot about it at this conference, so I won't repeat what people have said. You know, the idea given out at the Paris Agreement that decarbonization will be possible through, what is it called again, biological carbon capture and storage, or biomass burning, carbon capture and storage, or something of that sort. You know, these technologies, completely unproven fantasies, designed just to encourage us to believe that business as usual can carry on. So yes, I'm radically opposed to that technological fetishism, and I'm something of a Luddite. The Luddite movement in England, who smashed machines. If some direct action groups go and smash coal mining equipment, good luck to them. I'll come and join them. Edit that from the recording. So, you know, I sympathize with the degree of targeted technological Luddism, but on the whole, you know, technologies are very, very going to be absolutely vital for solving the climate and wider environmental problems. You know, solar panels, etc., etc., etc. Growth and wealth was, yes, an interestingly iconoclastic question from someone at the back. I forget who it was. Sorry. Yes, I think we have to be aware that as economic growth has proceeded, in many respects, the ability of human beings to flourish has expanded as well. Our lives are much longer on average, our nutrition is better, the opportunities we have to expand our minds are grander. We're living at an extraordinary moment in human history in that regard, aren't we? Because the ability of human beings to flourish in extraordinary ways has been enabled by processes that you can crudely summarize as economic growth. Yet the very same processes are powering us to, I think, doom. I'm a great pessimist on this, in terms of the scientific predictions. I think we're heading for a disaster, absolute disaster. It's an extraordinary moment. Traditionally in political theory, the idea was that, that economic growth goes hand in hand with our ability to control nature, and this enables us to open up new vistas of human freedom. Because the more we can control nature, the more we can mold space and the future to suit our own interests, to stamp our mark upon the world and upon the future. What a joke that all seems now. And why is that? Because the controlling nature in the micro fields, controlling rivers, controlling the way in which particular species of plant reproduce themselves in agriculture, etc., etc., etc. All these ways of controlling nature, they produce forms of blowback, and one of the particularly massive blowback is in the form of carbon emissions, which will potentially render the planet uninhabitable. And what would that mean for human freedom then? So I don't know, that's a kind of roundabout way of answering the question from the back on growth and wealth. Hang on while I overcome my poor eyesight. Alternative narratives, is it possible to create a society? I forgot to write down the rest of it. I think the question was, is it possible to create a much more egalitarian society? And yes, of course it is. Other people in this conference have been talking about, somebody at last night's plenary was talking about the fact that 99% of human history was organized in the form of gatherer-hunter societies, band societies, which it's very hard to know much about because most of their existence was not written down, at most in the form of some paintings on walls and so on. So we don't know a great deal about them, but the general assumption amongst anthropologists who know this stuff is that they were pretty equal societies. So it's obviously very much in human nature to be able to live in an egalitarian way. And I think it's absolutely, completely achievable, that sort of society, albeit not tomorrow or the day after. The refugee crisis, final question. You began your question by suggesting that the people who discussed refugees and immigration in the opening plenaries hadn't done so in a scientific way, and we need a scientific understanding of those issues. Fair enough. But then you moved on to say, and we hadn't suggested ways of hosting refugees and solving the problem practically. So it was a kind of scientific aspect to your question and a practical, ethical aspect to your question. Yeah, I don't think I've got anything particularly brilliant to say on those questions. I do write a lot about migration and the refugee crisis. I wrote a piece in the American online journal called Jacobin, called Open Borders. So I've that's my scientific analysis of the question is there. I'll use that as a not very sophisticated way of evading answering your question, but it's certainly in detail it's written up there. Yeah.
Thank you very much.